friends, and welcome back to another episode of Ghouls Night In, the spooky chat show with your best ghoul friends. I'm Penny Snark.
And I'm Midge Munster. And it's been a little while since we have chatted about horror films.
Yes.
And so I thought I would bring today another film that changed the kind of horror cultural landscape of the time. And that film is The Exorcist.
Hey, I just
And
watched this for the first time a few weeks
oh,
ago.
perfect. Well,
It's fresh.
it's fresh. Uh, well, that'll be great because I have in here not too far into the episode to ask Penny, have you seen The Exorcist?
I had not, but now I have.
Amazing. So yeah, this film was a real cultural phenomenon. It
Mm-hmm.
was one of the most large-scale horror films of all time, and it was the first horror film to be nominated for a Best Picture Oscar, and as
Mm.
well as 10 other awards, I believe, which it won 2 of the 10. Um, but why? Why was this such a big deal? And also, I want to talk about a lot of spooky real life things that happened around the production of this movie. Uh,
Mm.
so we're gonna jump right into it. So this film came out in 1973, and it was based on a 1971 novel of the same title, The Exorcist, by William Peter Blatty. And I think most people, if even if you haven't seen The Exorcist, you probably know the concept of The Exorcist. It's a possession film.
Indeed.
Uh, it follows the story of a mother and her 12-year-old daughter, Reagan, who gets possessed by a demon. And they kind of go through the works of trying to, as her mom notices changes in her, going through medical um, routes to try to seek help, and eventually turning to the church to have an exorcism done. Uh, this is actually the novel itself is based on a quote true story, and the author William Peter Blatty was very insistent that he believed that this was one of the only true recorded cases of an actual demonic possession and exorcism. So, the true story that this is based on happened in the 1940s in Cottage City, Maryland. The gentleman that is the uh, possessed in question is referred to in notes as Roland Doe, and a couple other names as well, but never by his actual name. So that was a mystery. But one thing that comes across in all accounts of this story from any eyewitnesses or whoever was that Roland had this Aunt Tilly who was a spiritualist. Always comes back to those spiritualists.
Hey.
And that Aunt Tilly had taught Roland to use a Ouija board the proper way. And then through that, his family, who were religious, Jesuit religious people, um, believed that through that they were having weird happenstances in their house, including paranormal type activity like objects moving. They were hearing muffled voices speaking, knocking on walls, all that good kind of stuff.
Classic spooky
Poltergeist
shit.
activity. Quite literally, as we learn, poltergeist means knocking spirit. So,
Hey.
literally, classic poltergeist activity. Um, up to the point where they also began hearing large groups of people walking through the house. They said it sounded like a military, like battalion marching through the home. And they obviously were very spooked. They confronted Aunt Tilly about her use of the Ouija board and her spiritualism, and not too long after that, she mysteriously died.
Whoops.
Whoops.
Wow. Way to avoid responsibility, Aunt Tilly.
Way to not take accountability,
She just
Tilly.
like, peace out, guys.
Yeet. Yeah. So Roland was very close with this aunt. And so when she died, he really became very withdrawn, which is normal for
Yeah.
grieving people, right? So whether or not these changes were due to a child experiencing real loss for the first time.
Yeah.
Every time I'm looking through these facts, that's kind of what I'm seeing. But
Mhm.
also, then there's a lot of crazy claims in this. Um, so Roland starts having fits. He gets really verbally like aggressive, loud. They would find him covered in bruises and welts and strange marks. And so they took him to doctors and psychiatrists. Sounding familiar?
Mhm.
And no one could seem to understand what changes were happening with him. So eventually they turned to the Catholic Church, which, if, as you'll recall, they are not Catholic, but
Yeah.
they are now like, well, whoever can help us, please, someone help us. And this was an
Jesuits
interesting.
are a flavor of
They
Catholic.
are, yeah, diet
Yeah.
Catholic, less Pope. Um, and so they take him to be examined by these two priests. And this, I thought this was a very interesting thing. During their meeting, they said that Roland couldn't take his eyes off of the Bible,
Mhm.
and apparently that is believed to be like a absolute sign of possession.
Uh-huh.
They were like, "Well, that's there it is. We
Have
got
you
you.
ever stared at something?
We got you, Satan." And so they say, yes, this young man is possessed. And when one of the priests asked him what his name was, he apparently replied in Latin and said, I am legions, but in Latin.
Yeah, very spooky.
Which that would, if that is true, that would be spooky because it's a
Mhm.
child. And this is like the 40s. So it's not like the kid went on Google and was like, how do I freak out a priest? So this goes on for some time. They are like, I believe, for 3 weeks performing exorcisms on him and trying to save his soul to no avail. The family eventually takes the boy home and things get worse. The mother claims that she found the words St. Louis branded into the boy's skin.
St. Louis?
St. Louis. So you get Milwaukee connection. Here's my Missouri connection. Um, so, mom sees the words St. Louis branded and thinks, boy, that must be a good message to tell me what to do. So they're in Maryland and they pick up and move to St. Louis, Missouri
I mean,
and take.
I can't say that if I saw something branded in someone's skin, I would be like, "I should go there." I feel like
Right. Well,
I
and
would
assuming
guess,
like
like,
this
that's
is
where the bad thing would happen.
right, like assuming that we're playing into the idea that this is the work of Satan and he's telling you to go somewhere, I would avoid that place at all costs.
Right?
That was my
No,
first
thank
thought
you.
when I was reading about this. I was like, "What? She went there?" But yeah, they do. They go there and it, they meet with another and I will say too, I think part of it is like the town that they live in Maryland is a small town and they've become the possession family at this
Nah,
point,
yeah,
right?
that's
Like
fair.
it's a very publicized case. It's all over like newspapers and like people are talking about this boy. So they move and once they get there they meet with another set of priests who take him and more or less put him in solitary confinement. They say they're moving him into a hospital, but he's more or less imprisoned at this
Mm.
point. Which again, I don't know. I have a lot of religious trauma, but I don't know that I really believe that possessions can happen in this sense.
Yeah.
And so this poor traumatized child, anyway, there's a
Yeah, I
lot
was
to
gonna say
unpack here.
I don't think it can help to put someone who's traumatized in
No, like
solitary confinement, whether or
this
not there's a demon involved.
grieving child and you're anyway. They finally get to the point where they're like last case resort, we're going to try to baptize him and that will bring him like as close to God as he can be. And so they do with much struggle baptize him. He accepts the like communion wafer and then the archangel Michael takes over his body and he's like I am Michael GTFO
Yeah.
and the demon leaves and the kid lives out the rest of his life with reportedly no memory that any of this happened. And I'm like, that's called
Alright.
trauma, baby.
Yeah.
That's called that's
That's
called repression.
repressing bad memories.
So yeah, not great. But for obvious reasons, with as much publication and things as this case received, this really stuck with William Blatty when he
Mhm.
wrote his novel. And so, whether or not that was a true demonic possession, it is a very true story that did happen and is what this film is based on. Uh, so, Penny, you've seen The Exorcist, we now know.
Yes, I
So, tell
have.
me a little bit about your experience with this. Did you find it scary? Did you like the feel of it? What was your experience?
Yeah, I would say I enjoyed it. I didn't really find it scary.
Hmm.
Um, but obviously, it's always hard with like an older movie where, you kind of are aware of a lot of the major elements and scenes. So like there's
Right.
less obviously The Exorcist is a film that relies a lot on kind of the shock value of some of the
Hmm.
stuff, which I was like, "Oh yeah, okay. That's fine."
Right.
I were like, "I've seen this. I know these bad stares."
Well, and you've played very well into my next spiel here, so thank you for that.
Yes.
Yes, because if you watch The Exorcist today, it is not very scary, and I was a person who saw it much later in
Mhm.
life. I know a lot of my friends saw this when they were young, and so it did scare them very badly,
Yeah.
which I can absolutely, now as an adult, I watch Psycho and it's not scary, but I accidentally saw it on TV when I was like 6 and I had nightmares about it for months, like,
Yeah, for sure.
um, but yeah, generally still a very like well-made film, good storytelling, really great practical effects.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
I was very impressed, like, I
yes,
thought it
good
was a really well
filmmaking,
done movie.
good filmmaking, great acting, but generally the premise of the film at this stage is not quote horrifying, and we've had a lot more disturbing and scary possession films
Yes.
since this film. But you pointed this out perfectly. For the time, this was an incredibly scary, horrifying movie and is still considered one of the greatest horror movies ever made because of the effect that it had.
Mhm.
And I want to spend some time analyzing why it was so scary because you're right, it does rely on shock value, but there was a lot to the timing of this that made it what it was.
I'm
Um,
so intrigued.
mm. But also, I do just want to spend a minute talking about people's reactions to the film. Because I did not know this. Apparently, some theaters handed out barf bags when people entered the theater because people were getting sick from watching it. There was a woman who passed out while watching the film and broke her jaw and tried to sue Warner Brothers
Whoops.
for the basically saying that there was subliminal messaging in the film that had caused her to pass out. Um, so people were really like having a time with The Exorcist. It was also, which we'll kind of circle back around to this, but MPAA ratings were very new
Mhm.
still, and the MPAA gave this an R rating rather than an X rating. And this caused quite a stir because in 1974, Roy Meacham wrote this review or article for the New York Times basically saying that because MPAA had stated that this was an R film, they were saying that the movie was suitable for children to see as long as they were accompanied by an adult. And he was so upset by this uh, that and they referenced in the article that a young woman had to be removed from a showing of The Exorcist and placed in an ambulance. Uh, and that article was making specific mention of Washington, D.C., which is where the original,
Yes.
like, yeah, where there's filming locations in D.C. Part of the original case that this is based on happened in D.C. And so, being kind of the prime place where a lot of children and teens were interested in seeing this movie because it had ties to that location, they were basically calling for uh, local police to arrest anybody who sold tickets to minors to see this film,
Oh my goodness.
regardless of whether or not they were accompanied by an adult. So people were like up in arms about this. Um, and so circling back, before MPA rating, everything, well, not everything, but prior to this and after the like 19 or early 1940s, movies were basically scaled by the Hays Code.
Mhm.
And if you're not familiar with the Hays Code, it was basically a set of rules saying what you could and couldn't show in movies. And the Hays Code unfortunately stagnated horror for a long time.
Yeah, I bet.
um, Dracula and Frankenstein were made pre Hays Code.
Mhm.
And you can really see the changes in the way the films were made when you get to things like Bride of Frankenstein and Creature from the Black Lagoon. They start leaning a lot more into nuance and just like suggesting things rather than, which there is art in that, absolutely. And I think filmmakers should be given credit for what they were able to do still under the reign of the Hays Code. But as a whole, it really held horror back and, you know, ostracized it even further from where people already had issues with it. It became this kind of like taboo, don't touch it
Mhm.
kind of thing. But then in the 60s, this kind of starts to change. Um, there was a big event that happened in 1963. I don't know if you've heard about this, but our president, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated in a
Oh,
really
darn.
public setting.
That indeed, that sure
that
happened.
that did happen. And this actually has like, I mean, obviously it has a huge cultural impact, but it has an impact in horror in a way you wouldn't really
Hmm.
necessarily connect and expect. Um, but JFK's, assassinated. Everyone witnesses it. It's like a huge global, like, oh my gosh. And before this, America, under the Hays Code and just in general, is living in like the Leave It to Beaver era,
Yeah.
right? It's a lot of blissful ignorance. Americans are seeing themselves portrayed on TV in this very like happy go lucky, squeaky clean, separate beds for married couples type image, when that's not a true representation of what's happening, but it's kind of what everyone is accepting as,
Yeah.
quote, the norm.
It's the narrative.
Yes, exactly. And so JFK happens, Lyndon B. Johnson takes over, and America gets heavily involved in the Vietnam War. And we're in a space now where technology is present in a way it hasn't been in previous wars.
Yeah.
And people are seeing in real time these horrors and things that are happening live, and
Yeah.
it begins changing the moral fabric of everything very quickly. Counterculture really rises up. We move into this space where we're getting hippies and it's affecting music heavily. We're seeing a lot of protest music, and it weirdly also brings in this stage of fascination with the occult. A lot of rock music leaning on these ideas of Satanism and things. The Church of Satan is formed during this time. And then in 1967, a little novel by the name of Rosemary's Baby comes out.
Dun dun
And dun
dun.
dun dun. And this sets the stage for the next chapter of what we're going to see happen in horror. Um, it sells 4 million copies in its first year. That's a lot of
That's a
people
lot. Yep.
reading one book. And it really kind of was almost this confirmation bias for a lot of people of what they were feeling and seeing as the world changed before their eyes. It was this kind of it fed into this paranoia that people
Mhm.
had that like sin and Satan was everywhere, right? It could be your friend, your neighbor, your
Yeah.
partner, anyone could be claimed by the devil. And so it really ushers in this new like Satan paranoia age. That book comes out in 1967. The Hays Code ends in 1968. Rosemary's Baby comes out, the film,
Yes.
in that year. And so Immediately following, we get the release of The Exorcist, the novel, which sells 9 million copies,
Woo.
and the film adaptation follows almost immediately. Um, and so, yeah, if you watch this for the first time right now, it's not very scary. But for people at this time, for the audience it was intended for people who were mostly white Christians
Mhm.
who's who are watching their children listen to rock music and be tempted by this free love hippie culture and all these things. They're getting this confirmation of their what they see as being the moral fiber of America unraveling all around
Mhm.
them. And where Rosemary's Baby showed the corruption happening to adults, The Exorcist really hits home in the fear that was the highest for people, that was the corruption of innocence through children.
Yeah.
And so that playing to that very real fear, whereas, I mean, yeah, ghosts are scary. And like,
Yeah.
yeah, that like that kind of monsters, yeah, very scary. But this was hitting home in a way that things really had not before. And then on top of that, like you said, with the shock value of some of these scenes outside of the Hays Code, things that really had never been shown on a
Yeah.
screen, it was just taking it somewhere horror had never, ever been. So that is why this is considered such an important film. And I was thinking about this because Penny and I were hanging with some friends. We were doing a little halfway to
Yes. I was just
Halloween,
thinking about this.
little halfway to Halloween Zoom celebration with our other Halloween buddies, and we were doing. I don't remember what that game is called. It's like the opposite of taboo, right? Like
Mhm.
basically you are all trying to write the same thing, and the prompt was like what movie you think of when you think of like spooky movies or
Yeah, or like
something,
yeah, like what's the scariest horror
or
movie?
the scariest horror movie. And 90% of our group wrote The Exorcist.
Yep, and and
Um,
and all immediately were like, "Well, I don't think it's not the scariest movie I've seen, but I think that it
right.
is considered to be
But
the
it
scariest
holds that
movie." Yep.
spot in history, and all these years later, people still look back to that as one of the greatest, like,
Mhm.
standalone pieces of this time, and so it's very, very interesting. William Blatty really struck gold with that one. He
He
really
did.
hit right while the iron was hot.
Right? He was like, "I know what people are scared of."
Right, right. But there are some also interesting happenstances that occurred around the filming of this movie, and I want to talk a little bit about that here to wrap up. Um, because there is also this kind of ongoing belief that the production of the film, as well as the film itself, is cursed.
Mm.
And and apparently can subliminally message you into passing out and
Right?
breaking your
You're
jaw
just
in a
gonna break your
theater.
jaw.
There were a lot of people saying that, like, the reels of film that contained The Exorcist were also cursed. It was banned in a lot of places. There was a theater that was struck by lightning while showing it. So there was, like, all these people that were convinced that this was a cursed film.
Cursed movie.
Um, but so, like we mentioned a little bit ago, filming took place in the United States, both in New York City and in Washington, D.C. If you're in D.C., you can visit the Exorcist steps. There's a little plaque there and everything.
They're very
um,
spooky steps.
very spooky steps. Um, but basically, there were a number of incidences that took place while they were filming or immediately following filming into the release of the film that people believe were directly correlated to people working on this movie.
Mhm.
Um, Smaller scale thing, not small scale by any means, but like a carpenter lost a thumb while working on the set.
Ooh.
A lighting tech lost a toe. Lots of appendages missing.
Yeah.
Um, Ellen Burstyn, who plays the mother, she actually so in the scene where Reagan, like, throws her back and she flies back into the wall,
Mhm.
uh, she was o obviously attached to a harness that pulled her, and during that scene, the harness malfunctioned and pulled her too quickly and actually permanently damaged her spinal cord,
Ooh.
and so next time if you watch this film again, next time you watch it, the scream from Ellen Burstyn in that scene is an actual scream of pain because she was horribly injured during that scene, and she talks about it in an interview because it was so visceral and good because
Yeah.
they were, like, zooming the camera in on her while she was in excruciating pain, and she says in an interview that she looked them dead in the eyes and said, "Cut that effing camera."
Hell yeah. I was gonna say this is just like for all of us Lord of the Rings nerds who have to tell everyone that Viggo Mortensen broke his toe when he
Yep.
kicked the helmet.
Yeah.
Now I've got that for The Exorcist, and I can be like, "Did you
Yes.
know that Ellen Burstyn actually damaged her spine during this scene?"
Actually permanently damaged her spinal cord. Um, so and a lot of these things, again, I'm like, "This was just bad film practice." But, yeah, that was bad. Also, there was a huge fire that happened on the set during not during they weren't actively filming, but during
Mhm.
the time of production.
Yeah.
Um, and apparently the cause has been ruled as a bird flying into a circuit board, which is very strange. Most of the house, indoor interior sets of the house burned completely, except for Reagan's room, which is interesting.
Mm.
And uh it ended up delaying filming, 6 weeks or 7 weeks, I don't remember exactly, but it put a substantial
Yeah, major delay.
pause, obviously, on the film because they had to rebuild the sets, and this also kind of ends up leading to then a very rigorous, like, over a year filming like, it
Yeah.
extends this so much, and the actors are living in it for so long, it's very intense, so that definitely contributed as well to, I think, some of these, uh, then we're dealing with people losing fingers and toes. It's
Right,
like,
people
yeah,
are
they're rushing and
overworked and
overworked.
rushing,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, but there are also 9 deaths associated with this film,
Mm.
which is a staggering number.
Yeah, that's a lot.
However, I've always heard this, but I never knew anything further than that, and after looking into it, I'm like, "Well, are they associated with the film? I don't know
I would
about
say,
that."
what's your definition of associated?
Right, so we'll get into that
Yeah.
here. We did have 2 people involved with the film die, during filming. A set technician and a night watchman for the set were both died during filming. Um, but we also have 2 actors, um, that pass, like, immediately after the film is finished. Jack McGowan, an actress, I hope I say her name right. It's Vasiliki Meliaros,
Ooh.
um, but she plays the mother of the pastor who is his
Oh,
mother's, like,
yeah, the
failing.
elderly mother, yeah.
Yes, so, both of those characters die in the film and then
Mm.
died shortly after filming wrapped up. Now, both of those actors are of an older, more
Yeah.
mature age, so is that suspicious? I don't know. She did pass of the flu, which is interesting but, like, also when you're older, the flu can hit you much harder.
Yeah.
So, and Jack died of natural causes. But it was, like, the week that the film released, and so everybody was like,
Ah!
"Ah!" Linda Blair's who plays Reagan, her grandfather also passed during production, which, again, I was like, "That's an old man
Yep.
dying," but, there was lots of just association with people connected to the actors passing away. The son of Mercedes McCambridge, who is the voice when Reagan is possessed,
Mhm.
um, her son ends up, like, not too long after killing his wife and 2 daughters and taking his own
Yeesh.
life. Um, so there was just a lot of speculation that people who had worked on the film were carrying something dark with them that
Mhm.
then seeped out into their life. Um, Again, I can look at pretty much all of those instances and see where it's just like, that was an old man.
Yeah.
Like, that was a carpenter who was being forced to work long hours after a set burnt down and cut off his thumb from exhaustion. Um,
Yeah, it does make me wonder, like, how many deaths can be, quote, "associated" with kind of, like, any
any
average film.
film.
If you're going as
Right.
far as, like, someone's grandpa died, I'm like, well, probably other people's grandpas have died while they were working on a movie.
Right. So, yeah, it
But
is
obviously, there's the extra, like, mystique of, like, a horror kind of thing that you'd
right.
be tracking. That's,
And
malevolent stuff.
it did end up going so far after the fire specifically, that they brought in a real life priest
Mhm.
to bless the cast and the set and, like, exorcise the set. Um, so they had belief that it was affecting people,
Yeah.
um, and I think that, in some way that probably is true just working that long with that heavy of material. I think probably much like what
Yeah.
happened to, my brain is saying Hugh Jackman, and that's not his name.
Heath
Um,
Ledger.
Heath Ledger, thank you. I'm so glad you speak Midge. It's
Yeah,
made
I know what's
makes
up.
this a lot easier. Yeah, but much like what happened to Heath Ledger, just like spending a long time with heavy material will definitely affect your mental health and the way you view things. And
Yeah,
so I
and
think a lot of these actors probably left this with a darkness about them
mhm.
afterward.
Yeah, I don't know if this is something that you're gonna get into, but it sounded like it was a pretty rough set in general.
Well, and that's, yeah, what I was saying with the uh harness on Ellen Burstyn. I was like, a lot of
Yeah.
this just sounds like bad film practice.
Yeah, I remember because I did, like, go to, like, do some reading about The Exorcist after I watched it,
Of
and,
course you did. That's what I
like,
love
of
about
course,
you.
you know me, I gotta read up on it, and it was, like, talking about, like, how the director, like, made the room, like, actually below
Ice cold.
freezing and stuff so that he could get, like, and, like, constantly was making people refilm so he could see breath and
The
stuff, and it
breath,
just sounded like
yes.
he was just kind of a huge tyrant,
And that's
and
like they were like, "Yeah, one morning we came in and then the indoor set, everything was covered with snow." I was like, "Well, yeah, he was keeping it at 30 degrees
yeah,
and there's
and
moisture in the air because
yeah,
everyone's
and just seems
breathing."
like in
Like,
general a high pressure set that you can
yes.
see where people would, maybe be making mistakes and stuff, like kind of
Yeah.
working in sort of an unhealthy work environment.
I also read that the, woman, Mercedes McCambridge, that did the voice of the demon, she again, like, people talk about this as if it's an accomplishment, and I feel really weird about that. They were like, "She broke her sobriety in order to she would, like, drink nothing but whiskey and chain smoked for weeks
Mm,
so that she could achieve that voice, and ate raw eggs, and then they would bind her to a chair so that she could experience, like, Reagan being bound to the bed so that the inflection would feel authentic." And I'm like, "That just sounds incredibly abusive to her body." Like,
right? That's oh my god. Now I'm gonna misquote this. I don't know who it was, but I remember reading like an article about like someone who like was a super method actor and was just like
mhm.
talking about all the intense stuff that he would do. And one of his co-stars who was like some like I'm sorry that I can't remember this guy's name, was like a British actor, was like, "Have you ever heard of acting, dear boy?"
Well, that's like, yeah, I just, like, I felt like, they're talking about this as like, wow, she really went after that role. And then what was crazy too is the director didn't wanna credit her for the voice in the
Ugh.
cast because they thought it would be scarier if the audience thought that Reagan was doing that voice, and she had to, like, fight them legally to credit her
Ugh.
for her work after all that, and I was like, "That's just, again, it's just bad practice." Like,
Yeah.
just actors being taken for all they're worth.
Mhm.
Um, so that's the real curse of this set,
Indeed, right? The real curse
is a
of The
lack of
Exorcist,
union.
right? Poor film conditions. If
Poor
only
filming
this was
conditions.
something that we'd gotten rid of in the '70s and didn't
Mm,
still have today.
right. Um, but that is a little bit about The Exorcist and why it has such a, you know, long-lasting space in our horror canon. Like I said, I do think this is a very well-made film. I think the cinematography is beautiful, the acting is great. Like, it's definitely, we talked about in our Ouija board episode that this kind of spurned the, like, or not spurned, began the fear of Ouija boards
Yes,
on a national scale. Um, so it definitely has a huge space in the
for sure.
trajectory of what we now enjoy, but, take it with a grain of salt. Or a bowl of pea soup.
Indeed.
Well, thank you all for letting me dive into horror. I know, like, I love that our listeners do, uh, uh, get into this with me once and again because I know, like, we tend to stray from horror and overly spooky things here, but I do like to get into the film history now and again. So,
Yes.
thanks for taking the journey with me. If you are enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving us a rating or a review wherever you listen to us. Those really help us reach new audiences. If your podcatcher of choice does not allow you to leave us a review, leave us a rating there, and you can always DM us a review, and we'll go ahead and read it if you're comfortable with that. I believe we actually have one that was submitted via Instagram message to read today.
We certainly do. This review is from Ash, Frankenho on Instagram. Uh,
Amazing.
and she says, "Hey ghouls, Australian Spotify listener here, 5-star
Nice.
rater. I am such a big fan of your pod. Every Wednesday, we're a day ahead, so that's when it drops for us. On my drive home from work, I fire up the old spot and laugh my whole way home. Being a funeral director,
Oh,
mortician, your
wow.
funeral death topics are my favorite, especially the comparison of laws and trends. Low flashback, but FYI, Costco Australia still sells caskets. The dynamic between you guys is absolutely spookalicious. Keep up the solid kook ghouls."
Oh, that's awesome. Wow, and thank you for your work in death services. That's amazing.
Yes, so fascinating. I did chit chat a little bit and learned a little bit more about Australian death care. So maybe one day
Ooh,
we'll have a Death Around the World
death
episode
around the
and
world. That would
explore
be
that a
awesome.
little bit more. Because we
Around the
have
world in 80 deaths.
I love it. Yeah, we've talked a little bit about like differences in funeral practices and stuff around the
Mhm.
world, but there's definitely a lot to dive into.
There
But
certainly
yeah,
is.
thank you, Ash. We'll try and keep being spookalicious.
Yes, thank you. Well, and that is a great reminder that if you would like to submit a review via Instagram DM, you have to be following us over on Instagram.
Yes.
You can find us over there at Ghouls Night in Pod. And if you are looking for me, you can find me across all platforms at Midge Munster.
And you can find me at Penny Snark.
And until next time,
Good.
good.